But yeah, I mean, to me, one of this is a difficult time in a lot of ways. I see it as, I do personally, and in my view of history, it's a very difficult time. But one of the beautiful, wonderful things about this time is the way women are emerging. Over the course of my,
you've seen it more
71
than we
years,
have,
I've seen enormous positive change.
Yeah, and I think that is the coming to the fore more of these traditionally repressed fields, like astrology, for instance. It's a lot of women like astrology.
Yes,
and
yes.
that was always in masculine culture, kind of, and especially science culture, is poo-pooed. But
Although Newton was deep into astrology, so there's some exceptions.
Yeah, he was a Christian, yeah, for sure. But you'll notice with astrology that with the rise of Hellenistic astrology, that the men are leading that field because it tends to be more rigorous, more theoretical and abstract,
More quantitative,
and mechanical and quantitative, closer to science.
Yep.
And a lot of these, they're a little bit on the spectrum, some of these guys, and they're like, no, this is science. It is indeed science. It's not merely a pseudoscience. And what everyone else is doing with astrology is pseudoscience. Like, we're getting to the bottom of things. We're freezing truth.
Right.
I've mentioned this to Adam, but it might be interesting to you. When I was studying ordinary differential equations, total differential equations mainly. I didn't get into the partial ones yet at the time, but I was studying total differential equations, nonlinear ones in particular, and those equations are very amenable to a representation called state space, where you take all the state variables, kind of the vital signs of the system.
Mm-hmm.
Like for a human being, it would be, oxygenation of the blood and heartbeat rate and blood pressure, and you make them mutually perpendicular, and then over time, the point that represents the coincidence of all those three measurements at each time, it will drift, it will change, and you'll have what's called a state space trajectory, and then you'll have various forms, various attractors and repellers and separatrixes in the state space. And this kind of is a geometrical representation of the law of motion of that system.
Mm-hmm.
And the problem is that as you get with systems that have more than two even, but even especially more than three important vital signs or state variables, you get an unvisualizable hyperdimensional space.
Right.
And astrology interests me as a way of presenting rich, complex information in two dimensions. Because the way I saw it at the time was that it's a clock of many hands.
Yeah.
And each planet
each
is a
planet,
hand. And it's a qualitative clock. It's qualities that are being described by the positions of the hands and the angles between them. And you've got a house system as well as a sign system that are like the positions on the clock, the numerals on the clock. So you've got a double clock already.
There's a lot going on. It's moving this way and that way at the same time, and then the different planets are moving at different speeds.
And you have multiple planets. It's not just really one hand. I mean, ordinary clocks have two or three hands, but they're really just different scales of the same thing. These hands are all qualitatively different. So you can pack enormous information into a horoscope without getting into what mathematicians call the curse of hyperdimensionality.
Right, it's too complex, there's too much going on, and if you were to distill it, it wouldn't even be intelligible, right?
You're probably right, it's so rich.
Well, that's why I'm trying to figure out techniques that actually focus upon what's important rather than just accounting for everything in the chart, which is what most experts try to do. It's like, well, I'm an expert because I look at that, I look at the aspects, I look at the solar return chart, all these techniques I use. But at the end of the day, the client is just wowed by it and they don't understand anything.
It's not usable for them, a lot of it.
Yeah, it's not. You're just amazed that there's so much going on. And so we already know that we're incredibly complex beings. What has this simplified for people?
In a way that makes it useful and learnable. Mathesis universalis, something that a non-specialist can assimilate and apply.
Yeah, and I believe that some of the techniques that I'm trying to innovate can be applied by anybody. Right? Adam's learned a couple of these techniques recently.
I used to fantasize, and somebody's probably already done it. In fact, I saw signs that it was going to be being done when I was still really focused on this. But I imagine, really leveraging that clock metaphor and having a watch, which is a transit clock, set for your birth horoscope, your natal horoscope. So it would light up or ring or something whenever a significant transit.
There are apps that do this now. Yeah, there's one app that seems quite good actually, and Christina uses. I forget what it's called.
Christina?
Christina's my partner.
Ah,
She
yes.
should be here tonight actually, but she was working on something. I think she was gonna come. I don't know what happened with her. But anyway, she uses this app that informs her when some significant event happens with her or myself. It says, Michael, this important event is happening with Michael. I'm not going to tell you what it is because the app doesn't show its work. Otherwise it would become obsolete. And Michael is going through a crisis, and how he deals with it will determine the rest of his life or something. But it's pretty concrete, and some of what it says is true.
That's applied astrology. I mean, if astrology is accurate enough, that could be a very powerful tool for people to have. And of course, everybody would have to set it pretty much to a different natal chart, but
Yeah,
it could be made settable.
It does that, yeah. So it has my stats, and it has her data, and so it's always sort of doing synastry for both of us. And what I like about the app is that it's always on my side. It always takes my side. It's like, you need to be nicer to him. I'm like, yeah, that's what I'm saying. Astrology is real.
Bias.
It is biased. Or else I just have a better chart. I don't know.
Or a chart that needs more kindness from your environment.
Yeah, exactly. But she's the one who's supposed to be working on all of these persistent issues, according to the app. But
What does it tell you?
it tells me that I just need to be nurtured. I'm going through creative periods all the time, and I need time and space, and I'm very involuted, and you need to be better to him. Good program.
Boy, you couldn't buy a marital counselor who would be that consistent.
I know. And it's funny you bring that up, because astrologers are now acting as marital counselors.
Using synastry or...
No, I mean using synastry, but I would say astrologers are sort of taking the place of therapists for a lot of people. There are a lot of people who would be seeking therapy, but they're actually seeking astrological consultation.
Even Nancy Reagan had help with her anxiety from an astrologer. I don't know if you
Yeah.
remember
Not just
that.
her anxiety. They were planning Reagan speeches around it.
And that
Yeah.
gave her less anxiety because she was less afraid he would be shot again, among other things.
Yeah, Hillary Clinton has
What?
a bunch of astrologers
I
who
had no
give
idea.
her advice. But the problem with her is that we don't really know if her chart is correct. We don't really know if we have a correct birth time. So that may account for what has happened with her career.
Or maybe she's put out a false chart so other people can't compute her, but she can have her astrologers compute her, but
Could be.
maybe she doesn't listen to their advice.
Could be. So right now everyone's trying to figure out whether Trump is going to win based on his chart. And a lot of people are saying that he will.
I'm feeling that he will. I don't know what that's worth.
I know. It's like, well, do you really need astrology to tell you what's going to happen? I mean, can't you just use your own powers of observation to see what's going on? But we don't know. I mean, we don't know. I looked at his chart. The zodiacal releasing people could not account for how he won. But I looked at his zodiacal releasing. I was like, okay, well, actually, if you just reverse the technique, if you just make if you release from spirit, if you release from fortune, he's having kind of a reverse peak period.
Yeah.
While he's elected. So there's no reason that he wouldn't win. And if we don't really know Hillary Clinton's chart, like, we also need to know who has the better zodiacal releasing setup.
So zodiacal releasing is this particular Hellenistic technique that he's really into.
It was rediscovered in the last 30 years through translations of some ancient texts. And it's a predictive technique that looks for career peaks. But I also use it just to look for
And
mental states.
yeah, there's Eros and
Eros is there. I haven't really researched it that much.
Significant other peaks and valleys too, probably. Can it be used that way?
For significant other, or for anything else you mean?
Well, for relationships, can it be helpful in understanding ups and downs in relationships, like for marital counseling?
I've used it that way. I won't get into it right now, but I can do synastry with it, just using parts of spirit and parts of fortune, which are generally used for career purposes. So I go beyond the career.
But it's not just even career for those, right? It's the combination of the two though is used for career, right? Because that's when the peak periods are.
Yeah, the peak periods generally talk about career, but
You know, there was one astrologer that I talked to way back when I was, you know, living in our political commune, and you know, way back in my Berkeley days, and haven't encountered it since. But this guy told me that, you know, I was very skeptical of the idea that the planets have some kind of different energies that cause different things on Earth.
right.
And he said, well, what it is, the secret of astrology as I see it, he said, is that there's an order to life on the Earth, and there's an order to the movement of objects in the sky as perceived from Earth. And astrology is a mapping from that order to this order.
Yeah.
If you have two systems of order, there's going to be a mapping between them.
Microcosm and macrocosm.
And it's just a matter of almost like a function. You know, this order here can be translated into this order here by a certain function, a complex function, which is the astrological analysis process. And that made some sense to me,
Yeah.
as opposed to
I mean,
planet causes.
it's hard to understand the physics of what's going on, but I stick to just chart interpretation without trying to sort of
Explain.
tackle the problem of what the planets are actually, like how they're actually influencing us.
That's
I wa-
more my specialty.
Yeah. Is it?
I mean, not the astrological aspects in particular, though. I'm becoming more interested in that.
Well,
But the
obviously, this
physics of
one
it,
astrologer thought that there was no such thing as an influence from the planets on things here. It was just that they had their order and we have our order, and
Right.
the two could be mapped. But there was no
It's
causal.
probably closer to my thinking.
It's
But
definitely
I just
cool-
don't know. I just don't know the answer, and it's hard to determine. So
I mean, this gets, I would get into the whole difference between causal thinking versus semiotic thinking in
Right.
terms of triadic relations as opposed to just simple brute force causal interactions. And I think
And maybe for you, the planets and their movements and positions would be a symbolic system, and you know, the emotional psychological process on Earth would be another symbolic system, and they could be bridged or mapped to each other. Would that work for you?
for me, everything's a sign of everything else, and so anything can be mapped on anything else. And so, what?
Well, it's interesting. I mean, muses used to talk about the astrological glyphs, you know, the planet glyphs and the sign glyphs and so on, as psi-glyphs, and he felt that it was a kind of a qualitative mathematics, or potentially it was. It was a you know, a symbolic in the sense of ideogrammic vocabulary for describing this human psyche.
yeah, it's kind of shorthand for sure. So you know, the
A
problem.
symbolic system, in other words.
Yeah, it's a symbolic system, and it has something to do with what's going on with us. And the job of the astrologer, as I see it, is not to understand how that happens to be, but to interpret the signs themselves in relation to us and life on Earth.
Yeah, that's a useful service, even if we don't understand why it works.
And that's
If it
actually where
works.
the notion of sign originated in Greece, and reading the signs of nature to tell fortune, not necessarily for horoscopes, but for the broader divination process that was happening in the mystery schools, and was starting to leak into early Greek philosophical thinking, and it gradually got developed in the Latin era of philosophy, and kind of got left behind for a while until now. I think it's pressing itself on us from within and without the academy, because I think it's really what philosophy was reaching for in the first place. It's just is interpretation of signs, because everything, I think, is
Symbolic, is sign.
we understand everything through signs at the very least. So
You know, I've noticed in the astrological symbols that there's a kind of, maybe as far as I've been able to do in research years ago, is kind of a lost alphabet. I mean, there are, you know, things like this. There are sickles, or
Yeah.
you know, and there are, of course, little circles.
They're hieroglyphs. I mean, there's a pictorial aspect. They're concept images
Yeah,
rather than just pure, you know, artificial images.
yeah. There's a kind of ideogram, and
Yeah,
but they have they could be decomposed into a kind of almost an alphabet of sub-signs that are mixed together in different ways to create the full signs. And I wonder where that
Yeah,
came from.
it's a mix and match system, right? There's like, so I mean, just look at the symbol for Scorpio. It's very similar to Virgo, and people mix it up easily. They're both M's, except the Virgo has a kind of loop at the end, whereas Scorpio has like a tail, like a Martian symbol. And some say that the little loop is vagina.
Oh, and the tail
is
like a
phallic.
phallus.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. So anyway, they share one component, but they differ in some other way.
Yeah, and I wonder if that at some point if that was intentional and meaningful more
It
than
was.
it is to us now,
Is it
because
not-
we've lost that sub alphabet. Of
Those who
symbols.
use
Well,
it,
it makes sense. Yeah, I mean, did it not make sense what you said?
The pictures
Well,
are
it
still
does.
intact.
I mean, and I'm thinking of like for the symbol for Earth, as the circle with a cross in it, I believe.
Series. Oh, circle with cross.
Circle with
Or
what's
a
the
dot.
symbol for the Earth? Is it a dot in the middle?
Well,
A circle
we're
with a
on the
dot?
Earth, so everything's
So we don't see it as out there.
Oh,
But, I mean, there is
symbol
a
with cross, and that's fortune, right? So that refers to the body.
And then there's the symbol for female. Of course, I'm getting into things that aren't astrological, like the symbol for female, the circle with the cross.
Oh, are you talking about? You're talking about Venus, maybe?
Yeah, I
versus
think
Mars.
that is that's right. And then
Yeah.
Mars would be
It's
the
just like a
circle
stick
with the
figure
arrow.
with a
Oh,
Yeah.
okay.
Yeah,
so there's definitely masculine and feminine connotations to those.
pretty strongly there.
Yeah.
And then for Uranus, there's the two sickle or moon-like opposing each
It's a
other.
pretty one.
And
It's
then
very
there's
ornate.
and then there's a cross in the middle, and then a little circle at the bottom.
Yeah, maybe there's some. Maybe some of these symbols are shrouded in mystery.
Well, Uranus and Neptune are relatively recent. So.
Well, the symbol remains. Well, yeah, I guess the symbol was recently created then.
Yeah, I'd like to know the
Yeah, I don't know
history.
about
I'd
that.
like to know the etymology of these signs.
The outer planets were pretty recent, so I wonder
Yeah.
if people
Yeah, the
were
symbol would
those-
have to be new.
Yeah, or they just pulled it from some. Maybe it has some connection with the name that they came up with.
It'd be interesting to see if there's some
Well, the
deep,
name is.
something deep
Although
behind
everybody
it.
now seems
Well,
to
that- well,
agree
it would
that
just-
Uranus isn't even
No,
connected
so-
with the god. He's more like Prometheus if there's a god. So.
But the symbol must be the old symbol for the gods themselves. So Uranus is an old god, and Neptune's an old god.
Right.
We just hadn't discovered the planet.
Oh,
Maybe.
okay, so maybe that's.
So there's
That's what I'm saying. Maybe I
the
don't know.
Neptune. Yeah, Neptune looks like Psi in Greek, right? It's like a pitch. It looks like
Pitchfork.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yes,
Right.
very much like yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, it's the old symbol for the god. I'm not a great historian of astrology.
Yeah.
So this is not really my pursuit.
I'm sorry to bother you with this, but it's just something that's fascinated me for years, and I just wondered if somebody here would know the etymology of these symbols.
Well, what's interesting for me about it is dividing up unity, and so a lot of the physics that I'm into starts with that same idea that when you take unity or a symbol of unity like a circle and you divide it, you're kind of breaking symmetry, and so all the manifest universe is like a topological descent from a kind of empty set or a unified topological set where everything is so related to everything else that there's no way to find yourself within that chaos. And so the second you break that symmetry, you find yourself within certain subset of relations that then has to face the broken symmetry that it's created, and you get automatic, depending on how you break up that circle, how you divide unity, you're going to get certain qualitative results that you're having to face within a process. And so time and space emerge out of that. Time in a way is the process, and space is the way that we order that process.
Mm-hmm.
And so for me, you look at an astrological chart, it's very similar to any kind of space. Our space, we're basically just using it to visualize a certain process of broken symmetry, and then the things that we face are consequences of the way that we've divided up that symmetry, and and it can be reflected also in a spatial state space, as you were talking about, or an astrological chart, which is another fractal spatial diagram that tries to encapsulate everything within that one little space as a symbol of this infinite process. Can never be completed, but that because unity is actually always represented in every little thing. Every sign has the at least the residue or the trace of every other sign or every other aspect,
Mm-hmm.
but
So
in,
you see
but
it's
in different
almost
proportions.
holographic.
It's very holographic.
Yeah.
I mean, that's the idea. I mean, the whole holographic paradigm, or the idea of a fractal, is just the modern conception of the Hermetic philosophy of
As above, so below.
Yeah.
below. And it's not just because they're just separate orders being mapped. It's because it's all one order that gets fractured into different orders, and then and then process is this way of reconnecting them, and then they're through cycles, they're kind of reconnecting, revisiting, and reestablishing new connections, and depending on how you divide it up. And so the 12 divisions is I think comes out of music theory, which in the Vedas was which I think the Vedic philosophy is kind of the oldest human high culture that then got kind of expanded upon by the Persians and the Babylonians that formalized astrology. And I think it comes out of ideas in music theory, specifically tuning theory. And so
If you look at the Pythagorean Plato,
I was just
book,
telling him about Ernest McLean last
yeah,
night.
he really goes into that view. Yeah.
Right, and so you've got the in the esoteric world, the two big ways to divide up the circle are 7 notes, or the 8th being the return, or 12 and the 13 being the return. And then theosophy,
The chromatic, I guess.
right? And so in theosophy, there's 7 steps to every major process, but then there's always these hidden other notes to complete the 12 tone or 13 step cycle. And so they have like hidden spheres, and so the planets are all kind of like, again, our physical planets that we see in the sky are also signs of levels of reality that correspond to this kind of topological space that we're all involved in, where we've broken up into these little pieces, and then all the other pieces that were not immediately apparent are coming to us and passing by us in time. And so time and space are these kind of reciprocal process that we use, where we kind of assume one thing as the center, and then whatever we didn't fix starts to move, and then those things are actually reflecting the assumption that we made about what is not moving. And so everything becomes a sign of that initial assumption or choice about what is it that is not moved, what is fixed. As in, we fix these 12 spokes on the zodiac, and then that creates an order. That choice creates an order that divides everything up, and you can use that to map everything else. It doesn't mean that's the only way of doing it, but there's certain ways based on geometry, based on the way you divide up a circle and the way that the angles work, and the same it's reflected in music depending on the way that you. And there's so much complexity because of the idea of incommensurability, that this was the obsession of the early Vedic thinkers, was that you can't have all the information in one representation. And so they were always trying to deal with that through this idea of the sacrifice, that you had to kind of sacrifice completeness for any kind of representation. And
Shades of Gödel.
Exactly. It's just it was their poetic way of talking about it.
There's a very simple topology that is intriguing about how it deals once you've broken beyond one. If you have one, let's call it a point, then this formula still works. It's the number of points squared. So 1 squared is 1. But now if that first point separates into 2, now you have 4 ways of connecting in this new space. You have the connection from one point to the other, from the other to the one, that's 2. Then you have the self connection of the one and the self connection of the other. So that's 2 squared equals 4. Now if you want to deny the self connections, you can do n squared minus n, and then you just get the connection from one to the other and from the other to the one. If you wanted to deny that non-commutative aspect, that there's a difference between from one to the other and from the other back to one, those two are different, then you can do n squared minus n over 2. And then you get back to just 1. There's only one connection between these 2 points. And it goes on and on like that if you increase n.
Yeah.
Like if every self connection leads to a new point, and every cross connection also leads to a new point, then your n gets bigger, and then n squared gets bigger, of course, and so on. And it's a very simple way of modeling some of that complexity that arises from breaking unity.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think, just to get back to something a little more culturally relevant, last time we were discussing practical solutions, and I think we were debating about philosophy being important, or theory, and being too worried about getting too theoretical and versus practical. But I think something Mike and I have been talking about recently is just how important metaphysics is for the future and cultural evolution and creating any kind of political movement that
I think we need a new paradigm that's adequate to the modern experience.
And it's
The
interesting
old
that astrology
paradigms
is,
aren't working.
that astrology is becoming so popular. I think that it reflects a desire for some
Maybe
kind
it
of
could become a
metaphysics.
source, because astrology, the natal chart and the transits, it's very dynamic.
Yeah, so
And I
natal
think this
chart
is-
refers to your individual psychology. People always want to know themselves today because everyone's kind of alienated from each other,
Yes.
right? People also want to know what's going to happen because they're anxious about the future. So it covers a lot of territory there. It satisfies a lot of need and want.
There's a real demand for it, clearly.
Yeah, I mean, it's debatable whether that's an actual metaphysical, but a lot of people realize the metaphysical implications of astrology, and so,
Right. Yeah.
so they're using it in that way. And some people might actually gravitate towards astrology for that reason,
Yeah.
because it implies a metaphysical structure of reality.
Yeah, I mean, it's the more practical aspect of the New Age, and I would argue that the New Age is becoming the new global religion. It's obviously not ubiquitous, but it's pretty.
I thought the
It's-
global
it's pretty
religion was
popular.
the worship of money, as if it was God.
Yeah.
Well, I think
Materialism doesn't. Yeah.
I mean, Adam, you're always talking about UFOs and and kind of occult science, or sort of new scientific frontiers, and I mean related. I think astrology relates to that in the sense that we are sort of looking at more objective models based in modern. That aren't tied necessarily to any one historical culture or place, and like with UFOs and stuff. I mean, we're basically mythologizing or building a metaphysic around, modern scientific kind of ideas and terms, and I think that's
A new cargo cult.
yeah. I mean, that's kind of like that. That's the way that. It's something that people can maybe all, somebody in China, somebody in India, somebody in Africa, somebody in North America, we all have access to the same information.
We're all living in the modern
We're all
world,
living in the
so
modern
we don't
world.
need
With the internet.
culturally particular traditions that feel kind of disconnected from regular life.
And astrology is at least, in enough different cultures, in enough different times, that, I think it's not very culturally specific, I think.
So you're saying that we need a new shared global worldview, potentially, that isn't tied to any traditional religion or traditional metaphysics, or something that people don't have to feel that they're submitting to another culture to embrace.
And that
Something
science
that we all
has marketed
embrace.
itself like that, but
Mhm.
it doesn't fulfill those deeper metaphysical needs,
Right.
because
It tends to deny that.
I wonder, talking about astrology as having a place in many different traditions, I wonder if it's worth for astrologers to look at the Maya tradition. Those people were skydiologists.
Yeah.
I mean, they were just onto the sky like nobody's business, and they developed a zero concept very early from that compared to other cultures, and in the course of their own relative development. And I wonder if there's an astrological doctrine in the Maya tradition that we could get at now, since the Maya glyphs have been decoded.
They were focusing on different things, though. They were more interested in longer cycles, and so
Yeah.
a lot of the work that goes on.
You mean they weren't worried about the quarterly report?
I mean, they had a lot of. They're it's similarly like baroque and detailed as some of the older Vedic texts, or like the Puranas, where they're. And this is what Theosophy claims to be an even more intricate explanation of these cycles within cycles within cycles, going like billions of years.
That sounds like the Vedas too, yeah.
Right. So.
Unfortunately, that I'll call him a bishop. That guy burned most of the Mayan books,
Yeah.
so we don't have much to go on.
Yeah, maybe they did have some more stuff that was closer to what we consider astrology.
They probably did. Babylonian times, astrology developed fairly rapidly, a few thousand years ago, because kings wanted to know what would happen to the kingdom, right? So there was less emphasis on personal psychology, if any. I mean, there wasn't really any. It was mainly about us versus the enemy.
And individualism hadn't really congealed much at that point. It was much more a collective.
The king was a very individualistic.
The kings were, but I mean, the people in general were not the kind of individualists that we have become.
No, that was invented later. One wonders, though, how people lived. And certainly everybody had their own interests and investments and personal attachments, and people thought of themselves as individuals.
And I think they were so subordinated to the traditions and conventions of their cultures that individualism was kind of muted compared to now.
Oh yeah,
It
people
was
felt
there,
less
but-
empowered to express their personal needs and to cultivate their individuality.
And to deviate from the taboos and the conventions.
Right. I mean, their world was more metaphysical, and there were probably more social constraints. But you also had less of a need to figure out who am I in relation to everybody else.
It was already defined.
I live in relation to my father and my mother, and these are my children, and I come from these people in this long history, and I'm with this social caste, right? So there was less to wonder about. Today, in this bourgeois place that we find ourselves in, a lot of people are like, okay, well, I grew up like most other people did. I was fairly privileged, or I was not privileged, but still I live in America, in the West, and I don't know who I am. I'm a consumer first and foremost, and I feel anxious all the time.
Astrologer, please tell me what I should do.
Or tell me who I am, rather. That's what most people are looking
Tell me
for.
who I'll be when I grow up. I hear all these people saying, when I grow, these people in their 60s, 70s, when I grow up, I'll know what my life purpose is.
Yeah.
Well, it's good to stay young, but yeah, I find that people are less often looking for career. People ask, like, what should I do in terms of my next step? But very few people are trying to figure out what their vocation is.
In a compensated sense.
How do you mean?
Well, like what their money-making career is going to be.
Oh,
They're
right.
probably more interested in their more
People are
poetic or
worried about-
artistic mission.
Practical exit. People want to know where their money is going to come from, because that's a practical need,
Yeah.
right? Understandably. But
True.
fewer people are asking, well, everyone wants to be a celebrity, but fewer people are asking, like, what is my calling? Like, what am I meant to do? How am I
Yes,
going to
yes.
really define myself, distinguish myself in relation to others? What
For a
is
while, that was big. I mean, 20 years ago, that was a big thing. in my
self-development
Yeah.
kind of thing, through business usually. But I'm just surprised that there are a lot of people with artistic leanings, or there are artists who want to know, what am I going to make it? Am I meant to be an artist? But fewer people are asking this question. I'm surprised by that.
I wonder why.
It speaks to the disempowerment that a lot of people don't see themselves as really capable of changing reality, becoming sort of artists of reality. And
So they just want to be told who they are on some metaphysical level, because they're
Yeah.
retreating from the world into some type of.
Exactly. They want to know. The ego is big for a lot of these people, for all of us. I
But
mean,
the self-experiment isn't an experiment on like becoming someone necessarily in the world.
the ambition is less than you would expect for the amount of ego that is driving people these days.
I
And
think
that's
since
notable.
since the '60s, there's been a huge conversation in the establishment-controlled media and in the kind of situation comedies and so on that they put out, like Frasier and so on,
Yes.
that has made
I
people
love that
feel, oh,
show.
we're just bumblers, we're hopeless, we'll never get anything right, we can't do anything.
Frasier's doing fine though. He's very distinguished.
Well, I mean, people love it, and it is well written, and people do watch it, but I mean, I think it's,
I love that you're talking. It might make a comeback. I thought it had completely, because I started watching it a couple of years ago, and my partner and I just really enjoyed it because it's so stupid.
and it makes humans look so stupid. I mean, there is some slow progress in the course of the series, but it's very slow, and most of
Really
these people are
feels in there.
fakers and bumblers.
It's pretty characteristic of network television, right? Because you have to kind of reset after every episode, so nothing actually ever changes. You have the illusion of
When
change.
you binge it, when
But
you
no
binge
real
it,
progress.
you really see that nothing's changing.
Right. Whereas now that TV is made, or at least the TV that anybody with any
Now
people
things are
watch
being,
it's
being made to be binged.
it's made to be binged, and they're telling narrative arcs, and they're interesting.
I agree. That's improved. I mean, I remember when I first saw television. I was around when television first came out.
Yeah.
I was watching, Flash Gordon and things like that were Saturday movies that were being shown on TV. And at that time, the big episodic series were totally sodium pentothal. I mean, there was no reference to previous episodes. In subsequent episodes, it was like all starting over, no history that mattered, no reference. And then gradually over the course of my lifetime, I've seen more and more of the series taking history and referring back to past episodes, becoming bigger and bigger,
Like a
more
novel.
and more prominent. Yeah,
More and more novelistic.
But
yeah.
wouldn't Spengler say that's kind of part of the cultural process, where the reference becomes more a part of cultural production as a culture progresses or as a cycle goes on?
Decadence. More self-referential. More meta.
Well, back to astrology and metaphysics. I think that, I mean, in some ways, a metaphysic. I mean, might be using it in a little. I think Adam knows what I mean, but it's your structure. It's what tells you. It's your programming that tells you how to act in the world, how to be.
Mm-hmm.
And so, I mean, that's what people want from astrology. I mean, that's what else could you? Why else would you study astrology than to be told, what to do? I mean, I think.
Understanding.
Well, I mean, but I mean, if we're talking about, if you're actually seeking self-knowledge and self-realization to sort of break out of that, then yeah, I mean, in some really deep esoteric sense, I think that is sort of the true purport of astrology, is like understanding to transcend. But I mean, the reason anybody wants a metaphysic, whether it's ancient aliens or ancient religion, it's they're trying to find some direction in the world, and they want to be told.
Now, for
They
astrology,
want to know how to act in their place.
I see astrology as having one different dimension than that, although I can see what you're saying. It does have that dimension, but astrology could be a source of, and from the beginning when it was used by kings and aristocrats, it could be a source of warnings.
Yeah.
Yeah, I suppose. I mean,
What's
divination.
what to do and what not to do go hand in hand.
Yeah.
But it's not just identity. I mean, I think a lot of astrology, the appeal of it is helping you discover your identity in order to transcend it and so on. But some of it is more practical. It's like, what's up ahead that if I know in advance, I
Yeah.
can
Like
survive.
knowing the weather.
Well,
Weather
you
forecasts,
could
yeah.
argue that, I mean, culture is, in some sense, that, because we have a set of expectations, a set of norms, and I know if I act in this way, I'm going to get a certain result. And so, astrology is, based in the stars, but you're still saying, if I act in this way, this is what I can expect.
And you could be natally, whether because of karma or whatever, you could be natally set up for certain hazards, certain dangers. And it may not be so much what you do that brings them on. I mean, how you respond to them, you maybe make a big difference in your future. But to know that those landmines are waiting for you in the future could be something that drives people to astrology.
Well, Michael was saying that it seems like, for the most part, that's not what people want to know about.
Yeah,
I mean,
I guess that's not it anymore. It was maybe for kings, but not for us peons.
Yeah, kings were, trying to figure out what the propitious time to do this.
Yeah, timing is another thing, definitely.
But if you can know, it's like the question: if you can know the time and place and manner of your death, would you want to know it?
That's a tough one for me.
So if astrology, if one's life is totally predetermined and astrology can explain all the events of one's life, then yeah, would you want to know it? People today find that a very unattractive notion.
Yeah.
People really fight against this more ancient way of doing astrology. That's what Hellenistic astrology tends to implicitly considered to be.
But isn't there a non-deterministic alternative where you could say, okay, there's going to be certain tendencies in my life that I can read from horoscopes and transits to my natal horoscope. So, it's not foreordained how this thing that's set up is going to come out, but it's coming. It's coming, and if I do one thing, it'll be different. The outcome, if I do another thing, it'll be different. But it is coming, and I'd like to know that it's coming so I can prepare.
Yeah.
Is that a motivation for people that come to you for readings or not?
Yeah, and people are always often worried about these coming transits. Okay, so Pluto and Saturn are going to be exactly conjunct, and in my chart, that they're going to be in the fourth house. Like, is something bad going to happen? Regarding my family life, people are worried about that kind of thing. So people know the transits are coming. Right, usually months in advance, and they're worried about what that will mean for them. Right, in the same way that kings were probably worried about such things. And so, people want to be told definitely that this will be good or bad, so that they know what to expect and they can brace themselves. Or
couldn't it be that planning how to respond, because if they respond one way, it'll go better. If they respond another, it could be worse.
Yeah.
So they have some control, especially if they're forewarned.
I should just add one thing. As far as I've read, the ancients did believe that there was an element of free will. Just
not entirely fate.
Not entirely. There was something that was left to you.
It's like a statistical probability type of thing.
It's like an Interstellar. It's like Matthew McConaughey asks this robot, "Well, how honest are you?" And he says, "I'm 90% honest." He could have been lying about that. If he's not 100% honest, he might be lying all the time.
A robot politician.
I think the whole determinism free will debate is part of what keeps astrology out of like serious academic discourse, because it tends to be framed in rather outdated terms. In contemporary theory, like subjectivity is not considered some kind of like autonomous free agency. It's agency and structure are always in a reciprocal relationship, and so anytime you talk about agency, it's always relative to some structure, but there's always another layer of structure, another context that you can think of things in that determines that agency. And so,
in other words, human agency is under pressure from all sides.
Right, but yeah, I would just.
And yet there is some element of.
Isn't that how astrology? I mean, isn't that actually how it is properly conceived?
I think it should be conceived that way. Yeah, but he's told me that most people really want to like dividing up how much, like 90% free will or 10% or whatever.
Yeah,
whatever.
someone has actually said to me, like, it's actually, it's like 70% free will and 30% is.
Which to me is silly, because it's
like, you've quantified it.
Right, because freedom is always a relative.
It's either one or it's the other, or it's both paradoxically, and I tend to think that it's both paradoxically.
Well, yeah, I think anybody that's read enough philosophy, at least in the last more current stuff, that would be the case. But I think it should be thought about instead of those terms, just talked about like knowledge obviously is empowering you by learning about what's going to happen. Yeah, you're going to have more agency, but that doesn't mean this whole idea of freedom is even kind of often contrasted in popular consciousness with having influences, and I think that's part of the problem is people have a real difficult time parsing out like, well, if I'm influenced then I'm not free. But like I think when you look at the physics of like things that I like to talk about, like quantum coherence, actually the more you're aware of your influences and coordinate them, then the more power you have. And to me that is a better way of thinking of freedom, is an actual way of directing and redirecting the things that influence you and having influence. And so it's a question of coordinating coherence across a broader spectrum of structures, so agency can be translated coherently across different systems of order.
Engels used to say, and he may have got it from Hegel, I think he probably did, freedom is necessity comprehended.
Right, exactly. Spinoza says a similar thing.
Yeah, I was rereading just a little section recently from Autobiography of a Yogi, and he was talking about this.
Yogananda, my guru.
Yeah, and he was talking about this one yogi who he declared the time of that he was going to pass from his body, and he said, well, he could. I think Yogananda's saying, well, he could, if he wanted to, just ascend, in total, but he's basically subjecting his body to the karmic field that is the endless motion of action and reaction. So inwardly he's free, but he chooses to keep his body like in that plane, and it kind of. I guess the reason I think of that is there's a part of us that's always inevitably entangled, and even this, liberated yogi whose mind is completely above the obligation to his fate, even his body is still, tossed about on these waves of, he's not actually free, so to speak.
Or he has a choice of whether to go with his mechanical fate or not. Isn't that?
Well, yeah. I mean, I guess that is part of it, but that's sort of less pertinent, I think, than just the idea that this yogi he's sort of acknowledging just this unceasing entanglement, with what they would call the karmic field or the karmic world.
What do the Buddhists call it? What's that term?
Samsara. But I think it's maybe what you're talking about, or at least it's what comes to mind when you just are saying, like, we're always, faced with infinite choices. It's not freedom versus predetermination, but it's an endless dialogue, and choices create new choices. And
yeah. And I like that example because, I don't know, it's that particular choice that he made has been a fascination of mine, just with like esoteric lore, because that's a question or choice that gets put to supposedly very advanced yogis. And so Sri Aurobindo, supposedly the lore anyway, is that he surrendered his body to prevent World War III, because it was actually like by, in a similar way, kind of surrendering his body to that kind of condition. It was a way of rebalancing the karmic debt. If he had continued to kind of try to sublimate the body, it would have had these karmic repercussions.
I mean, there's a tradition in the Eastern esoteric, culture about masters taking on the illnesses, the karmic illnesses of their disciples, and thereby saving their disciples.
Exactly.
Then. So this was, he took on the world.
Sri Aurobindo was adamant about taking on the world's karma, and so he was always. People gave him a hard time for just sitting in his room meditating, like, you're not doing anything for the world. He's just basically, fuck off, like, you have no idea what you're talking about. Because he, the way he framed his yoga is that he was just constantly, just digging deeper and taking on more and more of these threads of influence.
It's like the story of Jesus in a way. I mean, it's
Yeah.
related to that
Yeah.
concept that
Or
Jesus
just-
took on the karma of humanity and made
When
liberation
his partner,
possible.
the mother,
Prometheus. Artists today in the West, artists have always regarded themselves as suffering beings,
Yeah.
and they're doing it for the sake of mankind, right?
uh,
I've seen that
It's like
story too. Yeah.
his partner, the mother, Mira Alfasa, when she first met him, she said she could just feel, before she even knew who he was, she had had dreams or something, but she was just going to meet her philosopher husband's friend, this yogi, but she could just feel the lines of force just bending towards him, and that's what people said when they met him, that he was just like
gravitas.
gravitas. It was just. But there's another choice that the other mystics make, and so in the Taoist tradition, they tend to be more ascetic, and so but unlike some of the Indian mystics that just focus on getting their spirit free, they're very much into the energy of the body. But this is where you get this in the Buddhist tradition too, and in some of the Hindu tradition. It's called the rainbow body in the Tibetan tradition, but they actually would disappear, kind of like in Star Wars, right? And so,
Oh yes.
Would this? I mean, would this be like maybe the vital or Benno's vital being in this case, or I mean, even including the physical? Is this Chinese Taoist? Because I've always wondered about this. The Chinese tradition, it seems like it developed maybe even a more sophisticated understanding, or at least more emphasis of the vital energy, whereas the Vedic conception was more on a mental level.
yeah, I definitely think they have those different emphases, but I think that there's the difference with that choice, I think, is that the Chinese tend to they don't care as much about, especially about the world and taking on the suffering of the world and all that. They're just about taking that basically the idea was that they would transmute that physical matter into a kind of more coherent vital body, and so that they can have more power and influence on those other
Greater longevity.
on those other planes. Whereas a lot of the saints, for instance, they're often called, like even in the Western tradition, some of them were considered incorruptible in the sense that their bodies, and Aurobindo the same thing, when his body
And Yogananda also.
It took like weeks before it even started to decompose, because they were very coherent within the matrix here, and so
The way the SRF people talk about Yogananda is that he charged his body up with prana to the point where it wouldn't bacterially decay.
Yeah, and with the mother, for instance, they were like debating what to do. Like, will she wake up? Like, because she was trying to him and her both were trying to conquer death, and so after she died, like for a while, she was there was no sign of decomposition. They're like, well, is she gonna wake back up? Like, eventually, no. But
Wow.
whereas, one of the main expositors of Taoist yoga these days, Mantak Chia, his master. And there's other stories from eyewitness reports, but his master just left hair and fingernails, like within an hour of dying.
That's all that was left.
It was.
There are things in the Bible, even in the Old Testament, about what was the name of? Some people think it was an early incarnation of Jesus, and his teacher. His teacher disappeared into the sky, vanished into the sky.
Yeah, supposedly there's different stages, and so like the idea of the rainbow body comes because there's supposedly people have seen rainbows where these mystics have actually just disappeared almost instantly.
And I don't know if you've heard of this tradition of Bubba Free John or Da Free John, but he would talk about bhava samadhi, where you just vanish into the divine domain.
Yeah.
You just translate out of this domain into the divine domain. So
And
it
some of
comes
these,
up in a lot of
yeah,
different
and
traditions.
there's a lot of traditions in India where these people are able to then also remanifest too if they want, and so they're actually conquering, at least on some level, manifestation so that they can appear again, and they're immortal in some ways.
One of the SRF line of gurus does that. He's before Sri Yukteswar and before what's the guy's
Babaji.
name? Yeah, Babaji does that. He remanifests and then demanifests all the time.
Yeah.
So yeah, these things come up in many lines of those traditions.
So what is freedom, right? And so that these people are achieving a level of power and freedom that they're able to kind of choose different kinds of conditions that they want to subject themselves to, and who's to say what's more or less free? But in any case, they all seem more free than I feel. So.
Adam, can you grab my water for me? I don't want to mess up the gadgetry.
Where is it?
I know, I mean the vodka. But that's
Oh, that's what you mean by real water, I see.
slip of the tongue.
The Russian water.
Do you want your chaser,
Yeah.
man?
My orange juice.
Your orange juice and water. Here you go.
Thank you.
You almost walked out with just the vodka.
I want more spirit rather than. I'm very spiritual.
Give me some spirits.
So.
Healing spirit.
So yeah, just the question of freedom. For me, it doesn't occur. I feel free. I know that I'm probably not completely free or free at all. I live as though I have total freedom.
I'm like you.
It's the
Yeah.
common sense way of doing it. You know?
I'm struggling to achieve certain things, but I'm achieving them, and
Yeah.
I have some big sights set on things that I may not be able to achieve before I die, but I'm going to go for it. And so I'm aware of, of an environment and of difficulties within myself and without myself and so on, but I'm also able to choose to endeavor.
But you always choose in ignorance, and so that's the.
You don't have all the facts, right?
So this is something Derrida contemplated a lot, and so I tend to think he gets too indecisive with that, and I think that's the limits of philosophy, at least in the traditional sense, and I think why Deleuze actually is a kind of step beyond postmodernism proper or deconstruction is because he's trying to map these, in a way, chronotopology, to use Muse's term, or map the virtual in Deleuze's terms. And I think a lot of divination is doing the same thing. You're looking at the field of possibilities so that you can make better choices. Because if you understand the topology, that broken symmetry that you're trying to reconnect and translate yourself into further systems, then you better know what the environment is. If you're just living in the moment and you just want to just say make choices in relative ignorance and you're fine with that, then it's all a relative amount of freedom anyway. So
I know I'm never going to have total knowledge.
Right.
In any way I can foresee. So it's always a gamble. Everything I do is a gamble.
Yeah.
Every day I wake up and within an hour or two I have to take a dump. I don't really have a say in that.
Yeah.
I can hold it off, but sooner or later I'm going to have to take that dump.
And you can modify your diet in various ways, but it doesn't, still that remains to some degree.
Yeah, and that's how I know I'm not free.
Well, your body.
That's why freedom is an illusion.
Well, we definitely have to take care of our bodies if we want to be able to
It's very
accomplish
Buddhist,
it.
very Zen of you.
I don't even like the word that much because I don't feel that free either. But I'm concerned with power, and I want to have more power. I want to know what's going on so that I can more effectively express these impulses that are struggling to coordinate
And participate in the life of the cosmos to whatever degree we can.
Yeah, I wanted to participate in a greater degree and not just be stuck in the back roads trying to kind of make these lines connect with what I can know and sense and feel is a greater and greater and greater. There's always more to get to, but I feel like we're in a particularly hemmed in spot here where we're heavily conditioned. And so another
Absolutely.
mystic philosopher, Gurdjieff, talks about each level having a certain amount of laws, and so we're living in a part of the galaxy which we're conditioned by the most laws, and then as you kind of ascend this hierarchy, you're conditioned less and less by less number of laws. Actually quantifies.
In terms of possibility, it's interesting. When I've developed this contra-Boolean algebra of logic, And so when I apply
Boolean
that,
systems, yeah.
yes,
Love that.
when I start with Boolean, with a representation of the Boolean axiom system, Boolean logic, and apply it to itself, Boolean logic is a system of certainty. It's a certainty logic, like formal logic in general. But what comes out of that, the next logic that comes out, kind of its opposite, is the first of these dialectical algebras, which is a possibility logic. And then the next thing that comes
Right.
out of that is kind of a further opposite to both of those, which is which is an actuality, a system that can represent what actually happens, not the formal certainty only, and not the possibilities without determining what's going to actualize, but what did actualize. It's a language capable of expressing that. And then beyond that, there's a probability logic, which is still on the unit interval, but the elements within the unit interval are probabilities. So it's interesting. So it's a succession of certainty, possibility, actuality, and probability. Because there's inadequacies in each one that leads on to the next. Just a thought,
No, that's
just an
interesting,
interesting
yeah.
observation.
Yeah, I mean, I think some people choose further, just to make it more practical, people will often choose a more determined environment because then they can know what to expect, and then that allows for a certain freedom within that system.
And certainly less anxiety,
Where's the
perhaps.
fun in that, though? You know?
Right,
It's
it's
like,
somebody
don't
with
you,
more.
don't you enjoy the roll of the dice? Like, that's what I want to say to people.
Less fun, but less anxiety. Some
Right.
people are more anxiety averse. Some people are more regimentation averse.
No, I used to be more like you, and I used to be, and then I got to a point, I started getting health problems, and I was like, no, I want something, and so I started living a much more disciplined, strict life, so
Yeah.
that I can know all these physical things I shit at the same time every day, like, that I can fucking depend on, and that's actually nice.
But you're working on just yourself at that point. You're not trying to control reality. Like you're doing what you.
I don't make a distinction.
No,
Yeah.
but what I'm saying is like the person who's most disciplined is willing to take on adversity and the unknown in a confident way because they actually enjoy adversity and they want to see if they could conquer it. Right.
That's
So that's real freedom. Like I wouldn't want to enter into a system where I knew everything was the fun in that.
I wouldn't either.
There's no creativity in that.
Yes.
Right? So I think that's what discipline leads to. Paradoxically, the more disciplined we are, it's what they say about golf. Like, you know, a really good golf player or golfer makes his own luck because he's so good, right? It brings about, you know, the
Because
impossible.
of some
It is-
mastery.
It is almost a kind of magician through mastery, right? So
I once
he's not mastering the golf course. Though. He doesn't know everything on the golf course, but he's so good at what he does in any given situation that the ball tends to roll where it's supposed to go more of the time, right?